Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be for The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is of course an epic fantasy, a high fantasy, mythical fantasy. It's a history book in many ways, a history of the world of Middle-earth and of a history of the Lord of the Rings, basically. Most of you probably know quite a bit about this book, at least in terms of what it does for the world, even if you haven't read it, because it's very popular around anybody who has read much Tolkien at all. So The Silmarillion by Tolkien, as so many have said before me, is basically like a Bible for Middle-earth. And this is in that it tells the whole history of the world from creation all the way to prophecies of the end of the world. And there's major moments of history spread throughout this book. Of course, this book really cannot hold every single detail, and so there are plenty of books that go alongside that flesh out these stories and tell them in full. Things like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, or probably better examples would be The Children of Hurin and Beren and Luthien and The Fall of Gondolin. Those three books kind of take the great tales from the three great tales from this book and flesh them out and expound upon what's actually in those books. Before I get into the rest of this review here though, I'd just quickly like to say that if you're liking what you're seeing from an Erudite adventurer, we'd really appreciate it if you would like, comment, and subscribe. So, this book is written, it's written to be very mythical in scale, not just in the fact that it is fantasy, which fantasy and myth kind of go hand in hand all the time, but also in that the concepts that are being explored and the storytelling and the way that the storytelling is done in this book is very mythical. Of course, the stories themselves they often feel like fairy tales as well, but there's an overarching grandeur to the book that a lot of other stories don't have. Unless it's like a mythological history type story, they don't really have this same type of grandeur that the Silmarillion does. This isn't really an easy book to read. There is a through line to the story, but even that's fairly easy to lose sight of as you're reading it, especially if it's your first time through or you're not entirely sure what you're looking for as you're reading this book. And it is actually rather a complex story even with that through line. But all of that mixed with the fact that this is in many ways almost a collection of short stories that only loosely tie together, it just kind of adds to the difficulty of being fully engaged throughout the entirety of this book. I do think that the individual stories are really interesting though, and that they are actually really good stories, great stories, but they are clearly condensed from their larger narrative and modified to fit into the narrative of the Silmarillion. And by that I don't mean that the events in them are changed or what happens is different, but that the parts that are highlighted for the Silmarillion are the parts that tie into this overarching storyline of the Silmarillion, rather than going into every single detail of the Children of Hurin or something like that, like you would do if you were reading the Children of Hurin book itself. Of course, there's so much more that I could say about this, but that doesn't really, a lot of it doesn't really apply to a review in that way, and so I'm kind of going to stay a little bit away from that. But I do want to mention just how much of what we see talked about in things like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit gets backstory here. Things like the relationship between elves and dwarves, the ancestry of Gondor and of Aragorn, Galadriel and the great elven lords, Sauron, and so much more of what you see established in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings takes place in this book, or the origins of it are talked about in this book at the very least. But it's also not just information that's in the book, it's a part of the story that's being told. It's a part of this tale of the Silmarils. I feel like so often authors just make things up and stick them in the world for the sake of having things in their world, and don't really have reasons or stories for why that makes those things make sense for their world. Whereas Tolkien, everything about this book is very specific. It's there for a very specific reason, whether it's a storytelling aspect of this book or a storytelling aspect of another story. It's all there for a very specific reason, not just so that he can have a fully built out world with all these different intricacies to it. Of course that's part of it, because he wanted to make a real world that felt like a lived in world that could actually be real, that could actually be a history of our modern Earth. That's part of why it is in there, but that's not everything. A lot of it has to do with, if it doesn't tie into the story, it wasn't going to be included in this story. But even beyond that, we learn so much lore, magical, geographical, historical, etc. And through it all, you come to realize that The Lord of the Rings is as massive as that saga is, it's just a drop in the bucket of what has happened in Middle-earth. And while yes, Sauron is a threat, there's a greater story being told. Even in this book, Sauron is nobody. he's Morgoth's greatest lieutenant and stuff like that, but that doesn't mean that he's the most powerful being by any stretch of the imagination. He's far from it. And you really see just the scale of the metaphysical world that is taking place, and the war that is going on in Middle-earth, and it actually all does affect the physical Middle-earth, but also the spiritual side of Middle-earth as well. Sauron doesn't really have that much power in the grand scheme of things. He does, especially compared to humans and elves, but in a way he's also limited in the amount of power that he has. I also want to mention the Andy Serkis narration once again here, because that's what I listened to on this reread, and again, it's just beyond incredible. I was unsure a little bit how he would be able to do this one, since it's far less of a linear storytelling, and he has far less of characters to perform as, but he manages to capture the majesty of the storytelling in his narration without losing the intimacy of it, without losing the performance of the skill of his performance as an actor, but also just the importance of what he is, of the story that he's telling. He's able to capture the grandness of it while also not losing the little moments that are important, the moments of dialogue that we do have from characters that are so important and that make this book what it is. I really do love this book a lot, but even with how much I love it and as happy as I am to have it, I would be hard-pressed to actually give it a 5-star rating if I was being objective. From a purely subjective, my opinion point of view, yes, absolutely it gets 5 stars. But if I step back and actually look at it objectively, no, it can't get 5 stars just because it's not that type of book. It's not a book that's designed to be read and enjoyed in that same way. Yes, it is designed to be read and enjoyed, but it's not to be, it's definitely doesn't have the mass appeal that so many other stories do. It's just so different from the storytelling. We know that it's almost impossible to review it, let alone rate it in the same way as a normal book. But I will always forever be grateful for Christopher Tolkien for compiling the notes and putting some form of this book together, because even if it's not the final version that Tolkien himself would have released, I am very happy to have it and to be able to kind of get a glimpse into Tolkien's mind more so than just The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. As great as those are, there's so much more that he had to offer, both as a fiction writer, but as well as a philosopher, and as well as a professor of philology and of languages, and just all the stuff that he knew. You learn so much more, you see so much more of his mind as you read through the Silmarillion. So that is my review of Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and have our social medias linked in the description down below. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.